All right. Good morning, everybody. On behalf of Fourth Space, we'd like to thank you all for making the time to join us this morning. A special thank you to our panelists, Pablo Gershanik, Ariela Freedman, and Patrick Leroux, for coming together today to engage in a closing conversation to a very busy week of activities related to Pablo's residency here at Concordia University. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University and Fourth Space is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. For those of you unfamiliar with us, Concordia's Fourth Space is a university-wide platform focused on working collaboratively with our community across disciplines to activate research, teaching, and initiatives via process-based exploration. So it has been a great joy for us here behind the scenes to host the 3 public events part of this residency. We are eager to get the conversation rolling, so I'll just note that we are recording this talk. We are currently live streaming at CU Fourth Space. I'll put the link in the chat. The Q&A is open for your questions if you are a texter, if you like to text, or we invite you to raise your virtual hand and if you'd like to be unmuted to speak and join in for the Q&A. As always, the chat is activated for all of you, so we ask that you choose the panelists and attendees option from the drop-down menu as you share your reflections. On that note, it's my pleasure to pass proceedings over to you, Patrick. Welcome.
Thank you, and thanks, Anna and Doug, who you don't see, but who's behind the scenes making this happen. It really is a pleasure, but also a bit bittersweet, because we're basically concluding a pretty intensive week-long residency that Pablo Gershanik experienced with us. I'll just present our speakers. Some of you might be coming in unprepared, and perhaps you weren't part of the previous talks or classes. So Pablo Gershanik is an actor, director, and professor. He's a graduate from the École Internationale de Théâtre Jacques Lecoq. He's been an actor, touring internationally for Cerquilloise, Compagnie Philippe Gentry in France, Compagnia Finzi Pasca in Switzerland and Canada. He's directed theater, and he also co-directed one of the Sept Doigts de la Main Fibonacci projects in Argentina. He's taught physical theater, clown, and object theater for more than 20 years in Mexico, Argentina, and France. At the National University of San Martin in Buenos Aires, he created and has been directing the specialization in performance and interpretation with masks. He's currently an artist affiliated with Centre 4 in Paris and the Cité Internationale des Arts de Paris. So welcome again, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
And we also have a new voice added to the conversation, Ariela Freedman, who is a professor at the Liberal Arts College here at Concordia. She's also a novelist and a critic who works on trauma, modernism, comics, and graphic narrative. And she currently holds a Shirt grant on the subject of comics and the representation of pain. And I'm Louis Patrick Leroux, professor of both French studies and English, and currently Associate Dean of Research at the Faculty of Arts and Science. So this has been a very intense week. Just as a reminder, some of the events that probably many of you came to include an opening talk on Monday, which was titled Metaphor as a Possibility of Resilience. This was followed by an opening conversation situating the residency and responding to Pablo's metaphor, where we invited Bonnie Harnden, a professor in creative arts therapies, Luis Sotelo Castro, a professor in theater, and also co-director of our Center for Oral History and Digital Story. I was trying to unpack the acronym. We always call it codes. And we also had Mark Sussman, who is a professor in theater, but also the director of CISC, who hosted the residency. And aside from those public events, the Monday and Tuesday event, behind our scene, Pablo has been going to various classes. So Pablo, you went to creative arts therapies on Tuesday. You went to theater class and object theater, puppet theater, if I recall, on Wednesday. And you went to Luis's class affiliated with the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling on Thursday. So maybe as a first question, what can you tell us about those experiences? So how was your week? What did you learn? And maybe unpack some of what happened during those 3 classes.
This week has been a very joyful marathon. It was very, very intense and also very fertile for me. I could confirm something that I had realized by approaching your university and the way you create knowledge. That is the idea of a transversal way of creation. Normally in our countries, for instance, not always, but there's still an academic structure where the knowledge is stocked like in different shelves. So the psychoanalyst or the psychologist go with the psychologist, the artist go with the artist, the anthropologist go with the anthropologist. So it becomes like a close conversation. And I'm very, very interested in the way you structured the knowledge, which is programs where people coming from the arts, from the humanities, from the sciences, gather together, creating a melting pot, and not thinking that the knowledge is what gathers us, but problematics, but topics that we can, by approaching them from different knowledges, from different backgrounds, from different creative ways, we can start like doing a kind of alchemy, a kind of synergy that for me was very interesting to realize this week. As you said, we had like different points of the star. The first point of the star was the Body Harden group and the idea of working with trauma and working with people that trauma is going to be like their field in the way they want to work as art therapists, or to work with what are the tools that somehow the therapies can bring to the arts, and the arts can bring to therapies as well. And so that first reflection on it was interesting, because we could take some of the cases coming from the models to explore like different ways of transposition, with different ways of creating this metaphor that is what is at the beginning of all this conversation. And so that was very, very interesting to see with them all these different possibilities. Then we had another session with Mark Sussman, and with interest specifically targeting the idea of puppets, the idea of objects theater, and how to construct once again this metaphor through objects. So what was interesting there was once again taking personal lives as a departure point, but very, very soon from this idea of a personal narration of a story, having this gap, having this distance by someone else's interviewing a person, and with the collected material, with the collected story, creating a kind of little theatrical form, little object theater form that was called like a trailer, like the film of someone else's life. So the idea was in 3-4 minutes to create a portrait. But what was interesting is that you were obviously introduced by someone else, but you were already there. You were also there. So the idea was to create like a common production, a common space between what someone is is saying with objects about my story, not about what I said, but about what he asked, what he was interested in, not what I was thinking that my life is. That was not the point. So let yourself be interviewed. So these are the questions that the other person created. And so to later see all these different portraits that were so rich. And then we visited Luis Otero Castro's program, where the idea was also to talk about his group work with interviews, with oral history or oral tradition or oral sources. So the idea was having all this material coming from reality, so to call it. How can we take that as a departure point to take off, to create something creative, to create something artistic related to that, or different ways of narrating a story. So as you see, and with you also, all this dialogue about clowning and about the different possibilities that this language provides, dealing with trauma, but not only, but dealing with many different topics and facts that we are dealing as societies today. So that was my week. How was yours?
It was good, thank you. It was so odd because of this virtual situation, not to be able to basically accompany you physically to these various events, at these various classroom visits, and sort of have that hallway conversation, right? Like where we can share insights, share reactions, go for lunch, do all the normal things people do. However, at the same time, I don't think this residency would have been possible in the same way. So we used these circumstances. We took advantage of your the fact that you were available, even though you're in France right now, where it's later in the afternoon. And thank you, by the way, for adapting to our time zone, because I know sometimes it was really late or really early for you. So we appreciate that. So maybe to come back to your this notion of that you evoked a transversal approach, and it was really very much a part of the objective of this residency to ensure interdisciplinarity, and I think that you experienced it, and I'm glad that it worked out very well. And furthering that that notion of interdisciplinarity, we've brought in Ariela Freedman from liberal arts, who not only is a novelist, but she's also a thinker and a researcher in notions of pain and trauma, and it just felt like I don't know, it just felt like the right thing to do at the end of an very experiential based residency, to have an opportunity to pursue the dialogue. And Ariela, I know that you've been following Pablo's talks and looked at the videos. What are your initial responses to this residency, and also what questions might you have for Pablo?
So it's really interesting to hear about your work, and I very much hope to see more of it in the future, and maybe to meet you in person or see you perform in person in the future. I do feel like, as Patrick was saying, I miss that, even though there are potentialities that are opened up by the virtual sphere. You ended by talking about the relationship between clowning and trauma, and that's one of the things that I was really interested in too. All morning, I've been saying, I don't want to tell that joke about Pagliacci. Do you hear that in circus studies all the time? Yes. that relationship between, trauma and humor. I guess what I'm curious about is how you strike a balance and how that comes up also when you're working with students. I think I saw a little dinosaur in one of the models of La Plata in one of the photos. Did I really see that?
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
So,
True dinosaurs, a T-Rex, and a Triceratops.
Yeah. So how did they get there? And how do you make this decision of, when to use the laughing mask and when to use the tragic mask when you're dealing with really, really fraught material? And what do you think that humor allows you to do that maybe directly representing the trauma doesn't allow you to do?
These dinosaurs come from my kids.
Yeah, I thought so. I guessed it.
Borrowed, so they have a copyright, and they need to get back to their sources. Yeah. They will be back as soon as they leave the model. They will be back playing in the prehistoric with my kids. And what about the relationship between tragedy and comedy? What about the relationship between what we do as clowns and what the rest of the artists in the circus do? That is, for me, also a clue. We were talking some time ago with Patrick about this, about the idea that when you see the acrobats, they create impossible things. They create something that we could never do. So we immediately admire them because they are impossible bodies. They fly, they are so strong, and they can roll, and they can jump, and they can do in a way that we are convinced that is absolutely light, in a way that we are convinced that gravity does not exist. But if you are lucky enough or curious enough to see what happens while they are performing, you will realize that there's pain, that there is something burning, that there is something itching, that there is something hitting, that there is something, that is not always that light. But this possibility of transformation between something that is rude, that is tough, into something that shines, into something that has this kind of veil, because it's a veil at the end of the day. That is fiction. They create what heroes create. This admiration, when we see the heroes of the circus, as the same way we admire the heroes in tragedy. We admire them. We don't identify with them. Mm-hmm. We suffer because we see them suffering, but we don't suffer with them. By the other hand, when you see a comic character, you identify directly. He acts the same way your mom does, you do, your cousin do, and but at the end of the day, what we clowns do is kind of the same. That is, trying to create this lightness in gravity, in something that is so tough, in something that is so hard, that burns, that hits, that is kind of the same, but it's not necessarily physical, mm-hmm. or emotional. And what we do is we do this same mortal jump, but emotionally, mm-hmm. which is, how can we transform something that belongs to tragedy into something comic? But at the end of the day, you realize that it's the same thing, that mm-hmm. we cannot laugh about anything, that we laugh about things that are absolutely tragic because we take them comically, and we take tragically things that for the audience are comic. So in this paradox, we as clowns consider something tragic, something risible, something that where you can laugh, where the audience laughs, and we consider absolutely comic something that for the audience can be tragic. And by creating this kind of switch, the humor exists, the humor appears, the humor comes. Mm-hmm. And also because we can create a kind of a gap. We are not exactly living what happens, but we are watching ourselves falling down, creating an impossible logic that is not what we normally think about clowning, that they are silly or they are mad. It's not neither silly nor mad. It's paradox. It's another way of thinking. And by creating this paradoxical way of moving, we create this idea of comedy. So by this observation, by this step back, you are also in measure of taking the distance to be a witness of what happens, and being also capable of saying what we clowns say when we go on stage, absolutely naked of any other possibility than this, just to say, that's what we are. We do what we can, and it's okay. Even that way, it's okay.
Mm-hmm. So how does that work then in relation to the model? When looking at the model, there's an immersive quality. I think there's a way in which, I'm kind of wondering if you would have done this project without children, because I remember seeing my children build these whole worlds and being inside them and outside them in a way that was so compelling. So like the identification with the clown, there is the possibility of immersion and there is the reality of distance as well. Do you think?
Definitely. If you see your kids working, this difference, this distinction between inside and outside does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
They can very fluidly go from inside to outside and from outside to inside. Now I'm the bear and blah. No, that's not that. You see, so they can break in the way Brecht somehow thought the theater. You see, that is very interesting. Is the same thing that we do when we create models. What I do when I join groups to create models is first I invite them to recover the rest of what happened, and they have like different clues, like different. We have like a questionnaire and different questions to reconstruct as clearly as they can what happened. What was happening at the same specific moment that your life changed forever? What was going on in the same block and in the same neighborhood and in the same city and in another city and in the country and in other countries and in the world, to create like a choral version of that.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to start from your own experience. Who, when, how, what. And by constructing that, then you can start to create like all these waves that come later. By creating all these layers, you are inside because you are in the same specific observation that you've already had with your traumatic experience or with your personal or emblematic experience. But then you can start creating all these different points of view. That's the idea of a model. It's 360 degrees, so you can move around the scene. You can see it from a different point of view that you had never seen before, perhaps. We normally tend to think frontally. We face the experience, but we don't back the experience. We don't check the experience. We don't heart the experience. We don't use other parts of the body. It's here.
Mm-hmm.
And by constructing this 360 degrees, this circular vision, that is not just yourself in front, the exposition of what happened, but yourself together with 10 or 12 more people creating their own models. So your story is going to be in a kind of flow, because you are going to say your story, but many others are going to say their stories. And you are going to realize that you are not alone, that your story, that drama is a common stuff, and that every personal story at the end of the day is a social story.
Mm-hmm.
And that many things you didn't know, you share with some other dramas, some other stories, that you have like this underground linking that comes to the surface by narrating, by sharing stories, by creating forms together.
Sure. So the personal story to the social story. Patrick, were you going to say something? You looked.
I was just thinking about you're going sort of down the Brechtian route, but also evoking fundamental clowning principles, and mixing in the discussion on the model. So there's a few things happening. So first question, very briefly, do you think that the model that you created, the model of that moment fixed in time, of when your father was essentially assassinated with those 80 bullets by the powers at the time in Argentina. Do you think that this would have been possible had you not gone through clown training, had you not had an experience as an actor, had you not had that ability to create that distance, right? Persona, etymologically, sorry, comes from the Greek meaning mask. And so you know this instinctively in your body, you know this, but at the same time you've just ventured into this, well, dangerous territory, exploring fundamental trauma. And so first question, so would this have been possible without your training and experience? And secondly, do you think that recreating that without pathos, because you're how you talk about it, and that's really important, is not pathetic. So it's very much from a distance. It's like narrating something that's happened. Does this make it easier to, if not forgive, or maybe certainly to accept and understand the situation? So two-pronged question.
Yes, I'm an actor, but I come from a family where everyone is a doctor. Most of all pediatricians, and those who are not doctors are psychoanalysts. So the question of health is always there. So even if we think sometimes that the apple is going to fall very far from the tree, it doesn't fall that far. So when I was invited for the first time with the Museum of Memory in Buenos Aires to present 80 Bullets in the Wing, I thought that the invitation was coming from the visual arts department. So it was not a theatrical department. So for me, it was interesting to get into that story in a diverted way, not in a direct way. So I created the model, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna withdraw my body, so the body of my father can appear, the body of the wing can appear. My father was a rugby player, and he played the wing position. So that's why I called this 80 Bullets in the Wing. So I was dialoguing with the wing, with this idea of a wing, a broken flight and a massacred sportsman and my father. So by creating this audiovisual device, I thought that the device was going to be able to talk itself. But once the audience started coming, it was because of an accident. We are in Argentina, where the situation of the museums is kind of difficult. So they didn't have any budget at all to have someone taking care of the installation, where there was an electric train, a computer, a projector, and so on. So they said, okay, we are very glad to have this piece here, but you need to come to take care of that piece. So I started going because there was an electric train filming and projecting everything that the model was producing and so on. So by being there and by exchanging with the audience, different audiences, common audience, people having survived the experience of this concentration camp, people knowing the story, etc., I started realizing that there was a dialogue, that it was important, that was not just the device, but someone as a narrator that in the first person would say, hello, this is a story I'm very keen on telling you, on sharing with you. So this is where my actor started coming, where my training started coming, and in order to talk with Hamlet's ghost's father, or Hamlet's father's ghost. So this evidence at that time that I needed to put out from me, that ghost, that I needed to dialogue with this distance. So that is something that helped me a lot, I think, and that's why I also could I think I could go with the people having lived traumatic experiences to visit the way they could narrate, but with also a consciousness about a spectator. We are narrating a story, but we need to create a metaphor, because if the story, as you said, is just pathetic, and when I say pathetic, I don't say pitiful, but complete in a way, hermetic. It's rounded enough. It has no space for a dialogue. It has no space for the audience to interact with. And by creating this gap, by creating this role of the narrator, that is someone who's inviting you to come in, we could create this kind of dance, this kind of movement from one and the other, from the narrator to the spectator, from the spectator to the narrator, but always having this model as the intermediate step, not a direct step, but a veiled dialogue.
Pablo, you mentioned Hamlet just now, and I think you had mentioned Hamlet earlier in the week. Well, if you'll allow me to push that metaphor or metonymy rather, in this case, Hamlet is basically the tragedy of inaction. Hamlet fails. Hamlet just cannot get things right, and that's how things end badly. Do you sense that with the model that you explored, there was that danger of not getting things right, of actually getting embroiled and working with students, working with other people? What are some of the cautions that you might undertake, and because this can be tricky, right? Like, you can dive into this and address extremely difficult topics without a net. And when we're trained in improv and theater, like this is what we do, but we're on another plane now. Like, this is an artistic rendition of something extremely private and deep and traumatizing, but that people aren't necessarily always equipped to dive into. They don't necessarily have the tools to address. So I'd like to hear you about that.
If I can just add something to that quickly, when you were just talking about 80 bullets and a wing, I thought about Icarus, and I thought how strange and how interesting that this story about like a sun figure, falling, becomes a story of a son telling about the loss of a father. Like, that there's this tragic reversal there, and that Icarus, is a story about risk and flight and daring something personally and daring something aesthetically, but not without danger. So there's a way in which, like, in this metaphor of the wing, like, you're both the father and the son. You're memorializing the lost, broken wing, but you're also doing something that has personal risk, and that may feel like exposure.
Definitely there is risk. There is risk when we want to revisit a story, when we want to move aside from comfort, from identity, from everything that we've been told we are, everything that we constructed acting and not reacting. But once we start reacting to something, we can understand that something existed before, that we come from a lineage, that many different stories, personal stories, collective stories converged in order to create what we are. And that is something that for me is helping, is the fact of the group, is the fact of the tribe, is the fact of we are not alone, because we belong to that myth, we belong to that tradition, we belong to that universe. In my case, my wing; in your case, your personal story; in our common case, the wheel of flying. We need to fly. We need to take a step in order to get out from the labyrinth, our personal and collective labyrinth. The ways we find are different. Sometimes we create stuff, sometimes we create sicknesses, we create cancers, we create tumors, we create strokes. The body is holding our personal story always, and our collective story always, and the way it comes up is different. So there is a risk by acting, and there is a risk by not acting at all. That is something we in general, we don't realize. We are not told that our body is reacting to that. We are that story, and the way we live that story is the way our body deals with that story. So trying to answer, I think there are two different risks. Me as the creator of these labs and dealing with everyone's trauma, and at from in the other side of the desk, the people coming with their own personal stories. I think my experience is that what helps, first of all, is a group. The fact of being in a group, the fact of sharing a story, of creating this kind of dilution of the poison. We need to dilute this poison. How do we do that? First of all, I come from a tradition where we're talking about things is important. I had a mother who was able to open the dialogue always, and to say, this is an open story. We can talk about that. Stories we don't talk about are the stories that become a cancer, are the stories that become a personal or a social cancer. Everything we put under the carpet appears in a twisted way, always. So this idea of belonging to a group, or recovering this idea of a tribe somehow, sharing that story, having this empathic space where every story is respected, because every personal story is given and shared and supported by a respectful community, is something very important. Another thing is the idea of playing. We need to play. We are going to play. And playing means this step back, and playing means having the possibility of laughing and having the possibility of failure, as Icarus does, as Hamlet does. Failure is a possibility, definitely. But the thing, as we clowns do, we deal with failure. Clowning means failure, but with grace, with dignity. Human life is a failure at the end of the day. We just need to go outside and see what a failure it is. But in the middle of this failure, we can fly towards the sun, and we can, in a very dignified, in a very dignified way, celebrating the flight. And that for me is the point. That's why we do arts. We celebrate the flight, even if it's a broken flight.
So I'm thinking of this very process-based art, and also the art of clowning, which is always something in movement. And then I'm thinking of the stillness of the model, and I'm thinking, can the model be a labyrinth if you're not careful? Like, how does it get activated? There's this really interesting critic, Susan Stewart. I went to look at her book again after I saw your first presentation, because she's got this book called On Longing, which is about the miniature and the gigantic. And she says the miniature exists in the infinite space of and time of reverie. And she links it to nostalgia and to interiority, but also to this diminutive, frozen, out of time version of experience where you have an illusion like of transcendence and control because you stand over it and outside it. And I was thinking, if it's frozen time, how does it work in relation to the movement, which is processing experience? Or do you not see it as frozen time at all? You're shaking your head. No.
It's not frozen. It's not frozen. Every time you get back to a memory, it moved. It keeps constructing itself because you add something that is different, because you are in a different mood. So the way you remember that becomes different by where you are today. the Ariela remembering today is not the Ariela remembering a couple of years ago and in a couple of years. And we add every memory we have, and you know that very well as a writer, it's a puzzle, it's a patchwork, because you integrate the three images that you have from the scene and you have it in one, and then someone said something, and then the media said something, or you read something, and so you don't know exactly if that's the way you lived or the way you created it. But at the end of the day, that's not the important thing for me. That's why I always say I don't deal with real, I deal with true. What you constructed is what you consider true, verosimile. And that's for me the importance, not what is true. We don't know what's true, but sorry, what's real. We don't know what real is, but we know what true is, what we consider true. So in that point, I think that the possibility of recovering that is always moving, and putting in your model that is also moving, because you are moving the model. The idea is that's the function of the narrator. You need to move the model. You need to create interaction with the model and with the audience. And by doing that, something very paradoxical and very interesting happens, which is something that is huge as trauma becomes little as a model. Something that is little as a model becomes huge as a social link. Okay, so
it helps answer another question that I had, because I was thinking, when trauma becomes reified, when it becomes frozen in a social narration, it seems sometimes like it leads to dangerous political consequences, or to limiting kind of cultural identifications. I'm thinking in my community, and I guess in your community, of just the memory of the Shoah or the memory of the Holocaust, the way that identity can get stuck on trauma and resistant to movement. But you're talking about the opposite of that.
We are that. We are the Shoah. No, we are the Jewish people. We lived Shoah. We passed through Shoah, but we are not that. We are not the victims of that. We are not the widows of that. We are not the veterans of that. We are not the orphans of that. We are also that. But if we identify as that, which is very dangerous, because it's very sweet in a way, because it's very identitarian. We are that. So everything is said. So I have this. I'm calm because I know who am I, and everyone recognizes me as that, and that's fair. And it's not. We need to reinvent, and that's why I fight a lot with this idea of victims. I don't consider myself a victim. I'm not dealing with victims. I'm dealing with people who had experiences and who want to transform. Not what happened, but what they can do with that. We cannot, once again, we cannot change what happened, but we can change the way we deal with that. We cannot avoid pain, that's for sure. Pain is going to be always there, but we can avoid suffering. And that's for me the most important thing that we've shared this week. Suffering is the way you relate to the fact. Pain is something else. Pain doesn't belong to you. Suffering, yes. Pain is there, but you can change that. And for me, that's important to understand that we are in a dynamic relationship with the things. We are not stuck, and so that's why even if we are that's the thing. Even if we are stuck in an image with a trauma, it keeps moving because it keeps coming and coming and coming and coming. So it needs to be moving. So how can we use that force, that strength, that movement in order to put it somewhere else?
I think something I've understood from this conversation, which is really helpful in understanding your work, but also just thinking about trauma, is if you add a Brechtian alienation and critical distance to an empathic immersion, you get something which resists just being co-opted by a sentimental reactive politics, I think. because you allow yourself to have those things that people talk about when they talk about empathy, like identify and be immersed, but then you're almost immediately kind of kicked out into a space of critical reflection, thought, and collectivity. Yeah, that's really useful.
Pay attention to that, to identification.
Yeah, yeah.
Pay attention, because I think it's interesting, but at the same time, is once again, we are here, but as kids, we are the wolf, but at the same time, we are somewhere else. So we can see the game. Otherwise, we belong to the game and we are inside the train and we cannot see that it's a train. Mm-hmm. And we think that we are that, and we live the anger, we live the hate, we live whatever we are experiencing, or the poor little me. Mm-hmm. And we cannot move aside and say, okay, this happened, but I can have another point of view.
There's a question in the chat. Oh, Patrick, were you gonna?
Yeah, but before we open to the questions in the chat, and I do encourage people to post them, I want to just bounce back on this idea of alienation, distancing, in order to create that space of empathy, but also self-awareness. I like the fact that what you're proposing, Pablo, is a dynamic model, and actually this is connected to my last question, which is what's next. But let me just add a little preamble. I keep thinking of Tadeusz Kantor, who you probably know, the Polish theater director, but also he created installations, and his notion of theater of death, which was actually a theater of recreating one's life through very specific moments, sort of fell within, I guess, a similar logic in that he would recreate these moments of his life in order to better understand them, but perhaps to control them to a certain extent. And at one point, he could have gone in a maybe liberating manner, but in fact, his later works, where he had created all these puppet avatars on stage, in his later works, he was on stage directing live, placing actors and making sure that no, that's not how it happened. This is how it happened. And so it was a very interventionist mode of action. And I'm wondering, so what's next for you with this model that you've created? Do you think you'll keep on working with it, or at one point will you think, enough, I'm going on to something else? So how static is that model? How much do you want to engage with it? And I guess it's a general question for anyone sort of creating this this diorama of one's past, essentially. When do we let go of it, or do we? Perhaps we can invest in our entire lives, like Michel Tremblay does, for instance, for this plays.
Good question. Good question. I think going to Cantor, that by being there, by being on stage, he's also creating a joke, saying, "I am here. You are watching something that you shouldn't be watching," and by doing that, he can, once again, he can step back. He can become a character. He's the director, but the character of the director. He's not the real director being there doing, or somewhere in between, so to say. So for me, that's interesting. This possibility of, once again, joining in and leaving the space. If I am going to do this all my life, I don't know. I think I don't know what a model is, and that's the first thing that I say to the participants. A model, I know what a model was for me at the beginning, and a model can be many different things. It's a process. It's a process. So it can be a song, it can be an installation, it can be a novel, it can be a choreography, it can be a performance, it can be many different things. So in my career now, this idea of a model is evolving. First it was 80 Bullets to the Wing, then it was the Intimate Models Laboratory that I keep doing, and I keep presenting 80 Bullets, but now it becomes a theatrical spectacle, a theatrical show, coming from the collaboration that I have with Daniele Finzi-Pasca. So now we are creating a show. that is going to be opening in a couple of months in Paris, called 52. If you remember La Plata is a perfect city where every street is named, but in the middle you have a foundational axe that takes 200 meters. So every public building in that 200 meters are together. So there's no street in between. So there's no, it's between 51 and 53. So there's no 52. So I wanted for a long time talk about the 52nd street, that is the street that does not exist in this perfect city. What is lacking in this perfect city? What lacks from perfection? What comes out from perfection? So we are creating 52.
Nice.
So to say, yeah, these models keep in evolution, in different shapes, in different forms, in different languages, and I think that I'm curious enough to see how the rest of the people that I can share that tool with deal with that, to keep going for a good while, to keep developing these models for a good while, and also because I think it's necessary.
Nice. So you heard it here first, a show that's being developed with Fizi Pasca, and hopefully we'll be able to travel to see it in Paris, and hopefully you'll be able to travel the world as you did before the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a little premiere for the Canadian audience. We haven't already shared that with you, but I'm very glad to say that we are coming with a 52 show.
We have two questions in the Q&A section. There's a question from or a comment from Luis Carlos Castro. He writes, I work with victims of sexual violence. Sometimes a victim wants to be acknowledged as a victim. To be acknowledged as a victim helps to help her move on, sorry.
Sure. I think that when I say not to identify with the idea of victim, what I mean is, once again, not to get stuck in this idea. I mean, you need to pass through. You need to pass to the constatation, to this elaboration that you have suffered, that you have suffered something that is basic, because sometimes we don't even realize that we have suffered something. In the case of women, is very common. Sexual abuse or different psychological abuses or many different ways of abuse are things that we cannot even acknowledge sometimes. So we need to acknowledge that. We need to recognize ourselves as victims, but not to get married with this role. For me, not to get stuck in this role once again. We need to move from that. We are not what we have lived, but we are what we have done with what we have lived, what we do with what we had lived. And that's for me the important thing, to transform that experience and to transform that so name. We are not victims. We have been victimized by a situation, by someone, but we are not that, not just that.
Right, so refusing to be defined by victimhood, but acknowledging the actual victim state or situation.
Yeah, because at the same time you can be a victimary, even of yourself, and that's complex. What part of that victim is dealing with a victimary that is your own personal ghost, and that for me is also important. To create that kind of poetic justice, what I call poetic justice, which is placing versions, which is being capable of saying, okay, this belongs to me, this belongs to my family's myth, this is the logos that I have inherited, but this is not mine. So, mommy, I give you this parcel back. Grandpa, I give you this that belongs to you. This is something that you could not elaborate, you could not deal with. So I received it, but it's not mine anymore. So I give it back to you.
Thank you. There's also a question in the chat that came through from David Modlin. So why is humility a problem in relation to trauma?
Why? Sorry, once again.
Why is humility a problem in relation to trauma? And if the question is unclear, perhaps David, you can
I would like
yourself.
Who made a question to join us.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, Anna, if you can do that with your magical powers.
Yep, we certainly can.
Okay.
Here you go, Donna.
Oh, sorry, Doug, it was for David.
Yeah, for David Modlin, there's a question. So
I think
Pablo
there's a question from Donna as well. So got two more.
Okay, great.
There's David.
Hello.
Hi, David.
Yeah.
Hi there.
Why do you want to speak with me?
Oh, you asked the question. We don't understand it.
You don't understand what?
Your question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I kind of answered back. Maybe another time I'll talk about it.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you're good?
I guess.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you. We also have Donna Davis.
Donna.
Okay. Could you read my question, please, Patrick?
Sure. Yeah. Do you think that within the pandemic experience, many people are learning new ways to express and cope with trauma, including many buried past traumas?
Sure. That is one of the questions that I've been sharing this week with the groups. What do you think this pandemic came to teach us? Is there something we can learn from all this traumatic experience that I think that is something that is unifying humanity more than almost any other thing in decades? This is the first common thing that we live as humanity in many, many, many decades, I think. This idea of pandemic, this idea of pandemia. So, and I think what is very powerful is that this COVID pandemic came to bring to the surface many other things that do not belong necessarily to this pandemic time, that were there hidden or manifested but not very clear, or under the water, or somewhere, and suddenly the naked truth suddenly, paf, we are starting to be absolutely conscious about many different things related to the way we live together as a society, the way we deal with the others, the way we deal with a common space, the way we deal with the planet, the way we deal with richness, how some rich countries are in a specific position, how poor countries are in a different position, how in a same society you have people who have access to things and others who don't. How by spending 24 hours a day with the people you love, you realize the way you really behave and the way you really are, even if they are the people you love the most, or whoever. So it's very challenging to the relationships. It's very challenging to the way we consider the others. It's very challenging to the sense of distance we have with the others. So I think it's a time where we can pull out some conclusions, and I think that's something interesting to start thinking together. What are these conclusions? I have mine, but I'm sure we all have like this intuition, this sensation. But because one thing I definitely consider is that we won't be ever able to get back to life the same way we did. Life is changing forever in this very short amount of time related to the humankind stories. But but it's very clear to me that we are witnessing a change of era. The planet is saying not more like this. Women are saying not more like this. Minorities are saying not more like this. Different little communities related to sexual choices, related to ways of creating a family, related to many to nationalities, to migrations, to many different things. The world is saying something is rotten in the kingdom of Denmark. Once again, I get back to
Pablo, just to wrap up, do you think the pandemic itself, which was very hard to understand and grasp, like something that was invisible, do you think it has prompted the development of people to start to think about new metaphors also? Even you think about the whole world, half the world wearing masks, walking around in a big performance.
I think this pandemic, I think, came to teach us that the world is a little window, and we have this window, and this window can be whatever we want it to be. Even better than a window, a balcony. This frame is a balcony. It can be just empty, white, nothing, or it can be inhabited, it can be fulfilled, it can be plenty of many things to share. That's my world today. We are like snails, but squared snails or rectangular snails. This is our house.
A window onto the world used to mean an opening up to many possibilities, and now we're talking about Zoom windows. It's like a lifeline, right? A lifeline onto the world. So there's just to pursue Donna Davis's allusion to new metaphors. Something's happening in our way to in which we relate.
Definitely, and the metaphor of a frame for me is also important. What do we include in the frame, and what do we leave outside of the frame? Because what we live outside of the frame, as individuals, as families, as societies, is coming to the frame. It's always coming to the frame, as in cinema. Something sounds, a light, something appears. The hors cadre, the way we call that in French, the out of frame. It's the same way in cinema. Everything that is out of the frame comes to the frame in a different way.
There's in the chat, there's also Mark Sussman, who would like to thank Pablo for this week of visits and engagements, particularly with our students. Thank you from Mark. And Luis, Luis also, Sotelo Castro also sent an email saying that he is very keen to pursue the conversation. Your presence galvanized a desire amongst the faculty members to work across disciplines. Anna's reminding us that recordings of all 3 residency events, the public ones, will be available on the YouTube channel for that's affiliated with For Space, and the hyperlink is there. So please go back and have a listen. And Pablo, you have a record now of all of these thoughts, these conversations, this dialogue. This could be a document from which to work on a publication, for instance. You have a show anticipated, and we were asking earlier on, do you imagine a book or like an art book with the images of the model, the maquette, and some additional thoughts? Perhaps this can be part of this process as well.
Definitely. I'm thinking of a book, either a kind of artistic book and also an academic book. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's something I would like to do, and that's something that reflects also the collaborations that I'm engaging today with a structure in France that belongs to the psychology. So it's a master in arts, and also, well, all these collaborations that this week in Concordia made me very, very clear that are possible and that are so fertile and so juicy in a way.
Well, thank you so much for being there, for running metaphorically from one class to another, from one conference to another. You can see the messages come in, a lot of appreciation from the students who just really appreciated your presence here, your thoughts, and help them going from strength to strength. And thank you for sharing your insights. Thanks, as a concluding word, thanks to the Faculty of Arts and Science, the Faculty of Fine Arts, CISC, the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Society and Culture. Thanks as well to ForSpace for hosting us. This has been a first virtual residency focusing on research creation, so both artistic and academic work. Anna?
Thanks, Patrick. As usual, you do such a great job wrapping up. You take the words out of my mouth. So I think I'll leave it here. I'd like to thank you and Ariela today for joining us. And Pablo, it's been such a great pleasure to get to know you throughout this week and beforehand. And next time, the little box will be ForSpace proper, you know, the in situ physical box. So we look forward to meeting you in the space in the months and perhaps years to come. Yeah, the recordings are available. I put the link in the chat. Today's will be available probably later today. And, you know, speaking of books at the very end, those of you who follow us on Instagram, we do a Friday read series. And today we're in fact recommending Ariela Freedman's recent novel. So check that out if you're interested in her work as well. Okay, folks, it's been a great pleasure to welcome you in our living rooms in various kind of capacities and ways. Please check out concordia.ca/4 for further incredible programming upcoming in the next weeks and months. And once again, Pablo, you know, it's been a delight really to hear from you and get to know you. And Doug and I are super happy to have had the opportunity. Thank you for all of your collaborations here. Alison Bowie, thank you.
I wanted to take just a little second to especially thank you, Anna, Douglas, and Alison, who were the visible and invisible body behind the scenes that are always there. And I think everything we have done here was possible because of your quality. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day, wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much, Ariela, Patrick.
Merci à toi, Pablo.
Et à la prochaine.
Muchos abrazos.
Igualmente.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.